The summer of 1944 burned hot across the fields of Fort Benning, Georgia. Dust clouds rose from the motor pool where dozens of trucks sat in various states of disrepair, their engines silent, their purpose questioned. This was where Private First Class Danny Kowalski spent his days, a 22-year-old kid from Detroit whose hands knew metal better than most men knew their own families. Danny had grown up in his father's garage on the east side, learning to coax life from dying engines before he could even drive. When the draft came in 1943, he figured the Army would put those skills to use. What he didn't expect was to be stuck maintaining supply trucks while his childhood friends stormed beaches in Europe. Every letter from overseas felt like a knife. Tommy Ricci had landed at Anzio. Frank Martinez was somewhere in France. And Danny? Danny was changing oil filters in the Georgia heat. The other mechanics didn't mind. Sergeant Buck Harrison, a barrel-chested man from Texas with 20 years in the service, ran the motor pool like his personal kingdom. To Buck, there was honor in keeping the machines running. To Danny, there was only frustration. It was a Tuesday morning when everything changed. Danny was underneath a deuce and a half, wrench in hand, when he heard the commotion. Boots hitting gravel. Raised voices. He slid out from under the truck to find a group of officers gathered around Sergeant Harrison, their faces tight with concern. Captain William Graves stood at the center, a tall man with wire-rimmed glasses and the bearing of someone who carried too much responsibility. His voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "We've got a problem, gentlemen. Intelligence reports indicate German armor is advancing faster than anticipated in the European theater. Our tank destroyers are effective, but we don't have enough of them. Production can't keep up with demand, and we're losing men because of it." Danny watched from a distance, grease staining his hands, his heart pounding. This was real. This was the war he'd been kept from. Captain Graves continued. "High Command is looking for solutions. Fast solutions. They're asking every base, every division to think outside the box. We need mobile firepower, and we need it yesterday." The officers exchanged glances. Someone mentioned requisition forms. Another talked about waiting for factory production. Danny felt something rising in his chest, something he'd been holding back for months. Before he could stop himself, his voice broke through the circle. "Sir, what if we didn't wait for the factories?" Every head turned. Sergeant Harrison's face went red. "Danny Kowalski," a voice growled, "get back to work." But Captain Graves raised a hand. His eyes found Danny through the crowd. "What did you say, Private?" Danny stepped forward, his heart hammering. "What if we built them here? We've got trucks. We've got metal plating from damaged vehicles. I've seen the schematics for the M10 tank destroyer. The concept isn't complicated. Mount an anti-tank gun on a mobile platform. We could retrofit these supply trucks, reinforce the chassis, add armor plating, and create something that could at least give our boys a fighting chance until the real destroyers arrive." The silence that followed felt like hours. Sergeant Harrison looked like he wanted to throw Danny in the brig. But Captain Graves stepped closer, his eyes narrowing with something that might have been interest. "You've seen M10 schematics? My buddy sent me drawings from Europe, sir. He's with an armored division. I've been studying them at night. And you think you could actually build something functional? Here? With what we have?" Danny's throat went dry, but he nodded. "I know I could, sir. Give me 2 weeks and a team. If it doesn't work, you can send me to the worst post in the Army." Captain Graves studied him for a long moment. The other officers whispered among themselves. Sergeant Harrison shook his head slowly, muttering something about fool kids with big ideas. Finally, Graves spoke. 2 weeks, Private Kowalski. You get 2 weeks, a small crew, and access to whatever scrap you need from the salvage yard. But if you waste my time, you'll regret it." Danny snapped to attention. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." As the officers dispersed, Danny stood alone in the motor pool, the weight of what he'd just promised crashing down on him. He'd spoken without thinking, driven by months of pent-up frustration and a desperate need to prove he belonged in this war. Now he had 2 weeks to build something impossible. The first 3 days were hell. Danny stood in the salvage yard surrounded by twisted metal and broken dreams, suddenly realizing the gap between theory and reality. The schematics his buddy had sent were incomplete, rough sketches made during brief moments of rest between combat. What looked simple on paper became a nightmare in 3 dimensions. Sergeant Harrison assigned him 3 men. Private Luis Ortega, a welder from New Mexico who barely spoke. Corporal James Jimmy Fletcher, a farm boy from Iowa with strong hands and zero mechanical knowledge. And Private Theodore Banks, a 19-year-old from Philadelphia who'd washed out of pilot training and carried the shame like a brand. They stood before a rusted GMC supply truck, its engine seized, its bed empty. Danny's grand vision suddenly felt like a child's fantasy. "This is what we're working with?" Theodore's voice dripped with skepticism. "You're gonna turn this piece of junk into something that can fight German tanks?" Danny felt the doubt creeping in, but he forced confidence into his voice. "We reinforce the chassis first. Strip everything unnecessary. Add plating from those destroyed half-tracks over there." But as they began, problems emerged like weeds. The chassis cracked when they tried to weld the first armor plate. The gun mount they'd salvaged from a damaged artillery piece didn't align with the truck's center of gravity. Every solution created 2 new problems. Word spread through the base. The crazy mechanic trying to build a tank destroyer from garbage. Men came to watch during breaks, their laughter cutting deeper than any insult. Danny heard the whispers, heard them calling him Detroit's fool, heard them taking bets on how many days until Captain Graves shut the whole thing down. On day 5, Sergeant Harrison showed up at the salvage yard. He stood with his arms crossed, watching Danny struggle with a welding torch, trying to seal a seam that kept splitting. "Kowalski," Buck's voice was quieter than usual. "You need to know something. Captain Graves is getting pressure from above." Colonel Mitchell heard about this project. He's not impressed. Called it a waste of resources and manpower. Danny didn't look up, sparks flying from his torch. "How much time do I have?" "Honestly, maybe 3 more days before they pull the plug." Mitchell wants Graves to focus on real priorities. He thinks you're just some kid playing mechanic, and that this whole thing makes the base look foolish. The torch slipped. Danny cursed, pulling back. His hands were shaking. Not from the heat, but from the realization that he'd gambled everything on an idea that was falling apart in his hands. That night, alone in the salvage yard under a single work light, Danny sat on the ground beside the half-finished truck. His father's words echoed in his memory. "Every engine has a heart, son. You just gotta find it and make it beat." But what if this engine had no heart? What if he'd been wrong about everything? Dawn broke on day 6 with unexpected help. Danny arrived at the salvage yard to find Luis Ortega already there, his welding mask on, working on the chassis reinforcements. The welds were perfect, clean lines that Danny had struggled for days to achieve. Luis pulled off his mask, his dark eyes meeting Danny's. "My father built bridges in Santa Fe. He taught me that the strongest structures don't fight the weight, they distribute it. You've been trying to make this truck into something it's not. We need to work with what it already is." Within an hour, Jimmy Fletcher showed up with a different approach to the gun mount problem. "On the farm, we deal with heavy equipment all the time. What if we use hydraulic supports instead of fixed mounts? Give it flex, let it absorb recoil instead of fighting it." Even Theodore Banks, the skeptic, came through. "I might have washed out of pilot training, but I learned about weight distribution and balance points. Your center of gravity is off by at least 8 inches. That's why everything keeps failing." For the first time, Danny wasn't working alone. The 4 of them moved like a machine, each contributing something the others couldn't. Luis's precision welding, Jimmy's practical farm boy engineering, Theodore's mathematical calculations, and Danny's vision holding it all together. By day 8, something remarkable began to take shape. The truck's frame now sat low and reinforced, wrapped in salvaged armor plating that covered vital areas without adding crushing weight. The gun mount, redesigned with hydraulic supports, could traverse and elevate smoothly. The engine, rebuilt with parts from 3 different vehicles, roared to life with a sound that drew mechanics from across the base. But the real test came on day 9 when Captain Graves arrived with Colonel Mitchell. The colonel was a hard man, 50 years old with combat ribbons from the Great War and a face that seemed carved from granite. He walked around the modified truck slowly, his expression unreadable. "This is what you've been wasting time on, Graves?" His voice carried across the yard. "A truck with metal scraps welded to it?" Danny's heart sank. But then Graves spoke up. "With respect, sir, I'd like to see it fire before we make judgments." The colonel's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "Fine. One demonstration. If it fails, this project ends immediately." They loaded a practice round into the salvaged 57mm anti-tank gun. Danny climbed into the driver's seat, his hands slick with sweat. Luis manned the gun. Theodore called out trajectory calculations. Jimmy stood ready with tools in case anything broke. If you're watching this and rooting for Danny and his team, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Because what happens next? Nobody, not even the colonel, saw it coming. The target sat 300 yards away, an old tank hull marked with white paint. Danny steadied his breathing, gave Luis the signal, and waited for either vindication or complete failure. The gun fired with a crack that echoed across Fort Benning like thunder. The recoil shook the entire vehicle, but the hydraulic mounts absorbed it perfectly. The truck rocked back on its reinforced suspension, then settled. No structural failures, no catastrophic breakdowns. 300 yards away, the practice round punched clean through the old tank hull, leaving a smoking hole dead center of the white target mark. Silence. Complete and absolute silence. Colonel Mitchell walked toward the target, his boots crunching on gravel. He examined the hole, ran his finger along the entry point, then turned back slowly. Captain Graves stood frozen. The gathered mechanics who'd come to watch the failure now stared in disbelief. The colonel approached Danny, who climbed down from the driver's seat, expecting anything. A reprimand for the noise, an order to dismantle everything. Instead, Mitchell extended his hand. "Private Kowalski, what's your background before the Army?" "My father's garage in Detroit, sir. Fixing cars since I was 8. "And you designed this modification yourself?" "With help from my team, sir." Danny gestured to Luis, Jimmy, and Theodore. "I had the concept, but they made it actually work." Mitchell turned to Captain Graves. "How many damaged trucks do we have sitting in motor pools across the space?" Graves checked his clipboard. "At least 40 that are written off as beyond standard repair, sir." "And how much salvaged armor plating from destroyed vehicles?" "Enough to outfit maybe 20 vehicles, sir." The colonel's jaw tightened with decision. "Kowalski, you just got promoted to sergeant. Effective immediately." "Graves, I want production authorization for 20 of these conversions. Use every available mechanic. I'm calling this the Kowalski configuration, and I'm presenting it to High Command in Washington next week." Danny felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. "Sir, I don't understand. I just thought. You thought you'd build one truck and prove a point." Mitchell's voice cut through. "What you actually did was solve a critical shortage problem. These won't replace proper tank destroyers, but they'll give our convoys mobile firepower until the factories catch up. Every one of these could save American lives." Over the next 6 days, the motor pool transformed into a production line. Mechanics who'd mocked Danny now worked alongside him, following the procedures he developed. Luis trained welders. Jimmy taught them about hydraulic systems. Theodore calculated optimal armor placement for each vehicle. Sergeant Harrison, who doubted from the beginning, pulled Danny aside on day 14. His weathered face showed something Danny had never seen before: respect. "I was wrong about you, kid. I thought you were just another hothead with big dreams. But you built something real. More than that, you gave these men purpose." 20 modified trucks stood in formation when Colonel Mitchell returned with 3 generals from Washington. They walked the line, examining every detail, asking technical questions that Danny answered with growing confidence. At the end of the inspection, a general with 4 stars approached. "Son, how would you feel about going to Europe?" 3 weeks later, Danny stood on the deck of a transport ship crossing the Atlantic, watching the gray waves roll beneath a darker sky. But he wasn't alone. Luis, Jimmy, and Theodore stood beside him, all promoted, all assigned to the same armored division in France. High Command wanted the men who built the Kowalski configuration to train crews in the field. The crossing took 12 days. They arrived at a forward operating base outside St. Lo in late September, where the sound of distant artillery was a constant reminder that this wasn't Georgia anymore. Captain William Graves had been transferred to the European theater as well, now a major overseeing mechanized logistics. The first time Danny saw his creation in actual combat, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. A convoy was pinned down by German forces 2 miles from base. 3 of the Kowalski trucks rolled out with regular supply vehicles, their improvised armor gleaming dull in the autumn rain. He watched through binoculars from a ridge as German machine gun fire bounced off the reinforced plating. The lead truck pivoted, its 57mm gun tracking a hidden enemy position. The shot was clean, devastating. The German position went silent. The convoy pushed through. All 3 trucks returned. Minor damage. 0 casualties. Word spread fast through the ranks. Kowalski's destroyers, they called them. Not as powerful as real tank destroyers, but fast, maneuverable, and available when needed most. Over the next 2 months, 47 modified trucks deployed across the European theater. They weren't winning the war alone, but they were filling a desperate gap. In November, Danny received a letter from his father in Detroit. Tommy Ricci had written to him, describing how a Kowalski destroyer had saved his unit during a supply run in Belgium. "The kid from our neighborhood built the thing," Tommy had written. "Can you believe it?" Or Danny. But the moment that defined everything came in December. Major Graves called Danny to a briefing tent where maps covered every surface and radio chatter filled the air. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. German forces were pushing hard through the Ardennes, and every available vehicle was needed. Sergeant Kowalski, Graves looked older now, worn by months of war. High Command in Washington wants to expand production. They're converting the Kowalski configuration into an official field modification program. Every theater of operation, every motor pool with the capability. They estimate it could produce 500 additional mobile gun platforms by spring. Danny sat down hard on a wooden crate. 500? Your improvised solution is becoming doctrine. Graves allowed himself a small smile. The generals who watched you in Georgia? They're now advocating for decentralized innovation programs across all branches. You changed how the Army thinks about field modifications. Outside, snow began to fall on the French countryside. Somewhere in the distance, another Kowalski destroyer rolled past, its engine roaring, its crew ready. Danny thought about that hot Georgia morning when he'd spoken up without thinking, driven by frustration and a need to matter. He'd wanted to contribute to the war. He'd ended up changing it. June 1946. Detroit, Michigan. Danny Kowalski stood in his father's garage, now significantly larger than before the war. The sign above the door read Kowalski and Sons Automotive Engineering. The addition of engineering wasn't just pride, it was accuracy. What had once been a simple repair shop now consulted on vehicle modifications for manufacturing companies across the Midwest. Luis Ortega had moved to Detroit after discharge, bringing his precision welding skills. He ran the fabrication side of the business. Jimmy Fletcher split his time between the farm in Iowa and Detroit, designing agricultural equipment with the same practical innovation he'd brought to that salvage yard in Georgia. Theodore Banks had gone back to school on the GI Bill, studying mechanical engineering at University of Michigan, but he spent weekends at the shop, still calculating load distributions and balance points. The war had ended almost a year ago, but its echoes remained. On the wall hung a framed photograph. Danny and his crew standing beside the first Kowalski destroyer in France, mud-splattered and grinning. Beside it, a letter from the War Department detailing how the field modification program had produced 612 converted vehicles across all theaters by war's end. Estimated lives saved. Impossible to calculate, but significant. Tommy Ricci stopped by that afternoon, walking with a slight limp from his Belgium wounds but alive. He'd brought his young son, barely 3 years old, who stared wide-eyed at the engines and tools scattered across the workspace. "Your old man built something special during the war," Tommy told his son, gesturing to Danny. "When everyone said it couldn't be done, he did it anyway." Danny shook his head, smiling. "I just had an idea. These guys made it real." He nodded toward Luis, who was teaching two young apprentices the proper way to reinforce a chassis. That's the real story. People working together, making something from nothing. His father emerged from the office, older now but still sharp-eyed. A letter had arrived that morning from Washington. The Army was establishing a permanent innovation program, inspired by wartime field modifications. They wanted Danny to consult. But Danny had made his decision. The war was over. He'd done his part. Now it was time to build things that didn't destroy, but created. Faster cars, safer vehicles, solutions to problems that didn't involve life and death. That evening, as the summer sun set over Detroit, Danny locked up the garage and walked home through familiar streets. Kids played stickball in the alley where he'd grown up. The world was healing, slowly, imperfectly, but healing. He thought about that scared kid in the Georgia heat who'd spoken up when he should have stayed quiet, who'd gambled everything on an impossible idea, who'd learned that innovation wasn't about being the smartest person in the room, but about bringing the right people together and refusing to accept that something couldn't be done. The war had taught him that, and it was a lesson he'd carry forever.